So I have worked on Jackie Kay's poetry in the past, in my kind of work on contemporary women's poetry in Britain, and this working on Red Dust Road on her memoir grew partly out of teaching. Because we have a course on narrative where we teach the memoir. And then I got a little bit more interested in it, and also kind of thinking how her memoir coincides with her poetry and is interlinked with her poetry. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about Kay's poetry, and then link to the memoir, and then try and connect the memoir, the style of the memoir, the concept of the memoir as a genre itself, to questions of national identity, ethnic identity, gender and sexual identity, and see how the book, in a way, connects all these different areas, and in that respect, in my opinion, contributes to a new idea of what a memoir is, and how we should maybe reconceive the idea of the memoir in terms of memories, in terms of identity, in terms of narrative. So Jackie Kay was born to white Scottish mother and a Nigerian father who met in Aberdeen, and then she was adopted by white Glaswegian parents. And her poetry, as well as her memoir, are directly linked to her desire to trace her parents, which started in 1988 when she herself was pregnant with her own son. And she writes quite movingly about this in Red Dust Road. She then traveled to Nigeria to meet her father in 2003, and then her brother in 2009. And quite a few chapters of the book focus on that and engage with these encounters. She has now lived in Manchester for a number of years, and in 2016, Kay was named the Scots Maca, and which is the Scottish version of the Poet Laureate, and she held that position until 2021. So she's a really interesting figure in terms of poetry, but also in terms of British cultural life, and particularly also Scottish cultural life. So I'm going to start with the adoption papers, because I think the adoption papers are mentioned in Red Dust Road, and I think there is a direct link between the adoption papers and the memoir, because the concept of the adoption papers has also very strong autobiographical elements to it. So she tells the story, excuse me, of a black girl's adoption by a white Scottish couple, and she tells this story in this collection of poems from three different viewpoints. It's the mother, the birth mother, and the daughter. And this unique and honest volume, this is a quote from Spare Rib, of poems has been adapted for radio. Also included in the book are new poems reflecting issues of sexuality, Scottishness, and being working class. And it's interesting because I think in Kay's poetry, these subjects are just turn up again and again, and it is something that she's really preoccupied with. But it's not a repetitive interest, but it is something that she wants to explore in depth, and often also in different genres. She also wrote some novels, and she contributes to newspapers. So they're kind of from various different literary point of views, where she looks at these connection of these different aspects of identity. And as I said, this is kind of her first approach to memoir and autobiographical writing. And what is also interesting is the way the adoption papers works, because the different poems are connected thematically and also structurally, but they're also standalone pieces. And I think that makes the book really strong from a poetic point of view, and exploring it as poetic works. So Kay wrote the collection when she was actually tracing her birth mother. So we can again see how these life events of hers influence her writing. And but in a way, these poems can never totally reduced to just an autobiographical internal monologue, but they are much more indebted to a rigorous intellectual questioning of this idea of the self and identity. So in The Guardian, she, in an interview, she talks about the adoption papers, and she says, in one way, I'd been writing the poems in the adoption papers for my whole life. I'd been making up an imaginary birth mother and father with my adoptive mother for years, since I was a kid. She would say she would say of my birth father, I'm picturing a Paul Robson figure, Jackie, perhaps with a bit of Nelson Mandela mixed in. And this is a very endearing aspect which comes up in her in Red Dust Road again and again, how the mother's stories about the birth parents of her daughter are in themselves kind of narratives that often have ideas of film narratives or popular culture, and also fairy tales. And I talk a little bit more about this. So while the adoption papers focus on the subject of family and lies and identity and families, so I kind of try to do this families, but also lies. It is clear that Kay does not regard these issues as straightforward, and that comes across in her poetry as well as in her memoir, that she always grapples with that. This is something that is difficult. This is not just telling a story, but the story itself wants to be told in a very complex manner. And sometimes you have this feeling that the story itself interrupts the idea of the memoir constantly, and we constantly have to think when we read this book what we are actually reading here and how we should connect to it. So structurally, this is particularly the case in when we look at it structurally. The collection, this is going back to the adoption papers. Structurally, the collection is divided into three parts, the earliest from 61 to 62, and then it is further subdivided in 5 chapters in part 2, 67 to 79, which then consists of 2 chapters, and the final element spanning the years 80 to 90 is divided into another 3 chapters. So we can see these kind of boxes and subdivisions, which are constantly commenting on each other. And the idea that you cannot just write about this idea of the identity of adoption, about family in a chronological and straightforward way already shows us that this is something very complex and complicated. So the disjointed presentation of the poems is further complicated by writing from the perspective of these 3 personas, the mother, the birth mother, and the daughter, which are often in dialogue, but also often in contradiction, also kind of separated from each other and commenting on each other. So it also develops these different scenarios. And that is also, we encounter that again in Red Dust Road. Red Dust Road is, for me, a kind of to a certain extent, a prose rewriting of the adoption papers. And I don't say this in a flippant way and as something where I would say it's not original. It is very original for me because there are so many poetic elements in the memoir itself. And that's why I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the adoption papers first. So the book also concludes then with a second part, which is called Severe Gale 8, which includes poems that engage with the question of identity from the various points of views of class, sexuality, Scottishness, and the ways in which subjectivity is mapped onto social and cultural spaces. So again, these are themes which we find again in Red Dust Road, but the adoption papers introduce them and talk about them and engage with them in depth. So this is from the adoption papers, and we can see how the having these two poems or these two voices next to each other really tries to explore the idea of family, the mother-daughter relationship, but also the idea of what family, what is family, because obviously the idea of adoption introduces a different kind of family, which we also see again in Red Dust Road. So I was pulled out with forceps, left a gash down my left cheek, 4 months inside a glass cot, but she came faithful from Glasgow to Edinburgh and peered through the glass. I must have felt somebody willing me to survive. She would not pick another baby. And that story is then also again retold in Red Dust Road, where she talks about that when her parents wanted to adopt, they said that there was they were told there's a long waiting list. And then her mother said, well, we don't mind, we are waiting, but also we don't mind any kind of baby if the baby's ill. And then they said, well, would you mind a black baby? And then, or a mixed race baby? And the mother said, yeah, that would be absolutely fine. Oh, well, then you can adopt immediately. So, so when she was born, she was quite poorly, and her adoptive mother came and looked after her. And there was actually a time when it was thought she would not survive. So that is something that really touched and moved Kay. And she talks about it in depth also in the memoir. And this is then from the point of view, so this is from the point of view of the daughter, and that is the adoptive mother. Maybe that's why I don't like all this talk about her being black. I brought her up as my own, as I would any other child. Color matters to the nutters. But she says, my daughter says, it matters to her. I suppose there would have been things I couldn't understand with any child. We knew she was colored. And this question of race is a really big theme in the adoption papers, but even more so in Red Dust Road. And Kay says before she kind of left her parents, she never experienced herself as a black person, and she gained her black identity when she went to university and connected with other black students and other black people and became much more involved in the movement. So this idea of how the adoptive, that obviously it was one of the reasons that she was mixed race was why she was given up. But on the other hand, also the attitude of the adoptive mother that she didn't mind a mixed race child was while she survived. So there is this kind of deeply troubling connection, how issue of race and how it impacts on the really very core of her life, so to speak. So in the adoption paper also, I'm not going to read this because it's got, and that is really interesting because it's written in Scottish with Scottish words, and so that's also mixed into the adoption papers where she gains this Scottish identity. And So this is where her mother tells her very early on that she is adopted, and it actually scares the child, and because she says if she's not my real mummy, she might go away and something might happen to her. So she's really scared that the mother will disappear, and I think. It's really interesting that she tells this story, but also the reassurance that the mother is there. And then it ends with this fantastic line, anyhow, a day after I got my guinea pig and forgot all about it, which again kind of delves into the world of childhood, where deep fears and the idea of forgetting about it are very close next to each other. And I think again she connects this to fairy tales. So the fear that the mother disappears is connected to the fairy tales the mother tells the child. So the idea of narrative and tales and how she understands her own identity is always refracted through through narrative and through kind of literary stories. And this is even more so when she starts thinking more deeply about her identity as partly Nigerian and African. So she says in an interview in 2010, part of me came from Africa, part of me was foreign to myself, strange to myself, since I had never been to the dark continent and could only really have it burning away hot and dusty in my mind. So you can already see the Red Dust Road. It is not so much that being black in a white country means that people don't accept you as, say, Scottish. It is that being black in a white country makes you a stranger to yourself. It is not the foreigner without, it is the foreigner within. That is interesting. So these idea of foreignness, these different aspects, and it's interesting how she connects the idea of being black, but also being Scottish, and obviously also then being Scottish in Great Britain is also another aspect of foreignness sometimes. So this is something that really preoccupies her. And so there's this kind of imaginative recreation of origins to feel the gaps and absences in life, in the life narrative, is something that really becomes a theme in her work. And it becomes very clear that for her, identity should be understood not as something stable and given, but as a storytelling, intersectional connections, sexual, gender, national, ethnic identities constantly comment on each other and question the concept of a given identity. So we are kind of in this kind of situation where we're talking about an autobiography or a memoir, which is usually based on the idea of giving more information about a person and how a person became the person who she is. But at the same time, she questions this idea that we kind of arrive at the end, or that we have at the end an understanding who a person is, but it becomes constantly kind of questioned and changes, and the person who is presented and part of this autobiography and part also of, for example, the adoption papers, is never kind of one, is never the same when we read through it, but it's kind of the narrative which changes constantly. So I'm going a little bit more towards the memoir, I just went, I thought it's quite interesting, and we do this with our students. So there are these different covers where the memoir was published, and we often kind of give these to our students and ask them how the cover, what kind of information, how there's kind of peritextual materials, how they connect to the idea of the memoir, and how they already in a way shape expectations of how of what we are expect to see. So that's why I thought it quite interesting to put these different covers there. So I want to start with a quote about from Paul Ricoeur from Time and Narrative, which I think is really interesting, where he talks about this idea of the self as narrative. So to state the identity of an individual or a community is to answer the question, who did this? Who is the agent, the author? We first answer this question by naming someone, that is, by designating them with a proper name. But what is the basis for the permanence of this proper name? What justifies our taking the subject of an action so designated by this, her, by his, her, or its proper name as the same throughout a life that stretches from birth to death? The answer has to be narrative. To answer to the question who is to tell the story of a life. The story told tells about the action of the who, and the identity of this who, therefore, itself must be narrative identity. So Ricoeur makes this very strong point how in a way, identity is much more a verb than a noun, because it is constantly under process. It constantly is developed, and it constantly, and it only comes into being via narrative. And I think that after I've read Red Dust Road, that becomes very clear that that is underlying this project of a memoir, if you want to call it like this. We should also obviously remember that memoirs and autobiographies are often written at the end of life, or traditionally, not so much anymore. But this is really a book. I mean, Jackie Kay is still quite alive and still and it's certainly not written from the perspective of hindsight at all, or retrospectively in any sense, but it is very much a kind of slice of life, so to speak. So another element which I think is really was really influential and had a great impact on Kay is Audre Lorde's work. And Audre Lorde came up with this term biomythography, which is a style of composition that weaves myth, history, and biography in epic narrative. For Audre Lorde, who the most famous narrative for this is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name from 1982. This is again deeply connected to Black identity, and how in a world where a sense of identity is still very much linked to the idea of Western whiteness and other dominant discourses, how the Black community has to engage with the question of identity from a different narrative point of view. So for her, this is autobiographical writing that emphasizes intersectionality and focuses on identity as under constant construction. And again, that obviously has to do with the diaspora of the Black community from a historical point of view, and the sense of being dispersed all over the world, and the idea of this whole discussion of belonging culturally as well as legally often. So this often creates various different selves, so such as a kind of internal, external, and multiple selves. So in I think Kay responds to this in Red Dust Road, where she says, for example, the jigsaw can never ever be completed. You are made already, though you don't properly know it. You are made up from a mixture of myth and gene. You are part fable, part porridge. I have found them both now, but I have not found myself. This is about the parents. I had already found myself. I already knew who I was, I think, or did I? So you can see how she always weaves these narratives and these stories and then kind of disentangles them again and questions them again and starts anew. So Audre Lorde, I just want to go back a little bit to Audre Lorde, which I think is really interesting, where she talks about this question of identity and biomythography. She says, there's always someone asking you to underline one piece of yourself, whether it's Black woman, mother, dyke, teacher, because that's the piece that they need to key into. They want to dismiss everything else. So again, Lorde is kind of one of the first really representatives of this idea of intersectional identity. And when Kay met Audre Lorde in 1984, Lorde actually advised her that she should be proudly African and Scottish, and to embrace both. One need not exclude the other. So Lorde's writing, but also the friendship with Lorde, had a really big impact on Kay's own sense of identity, but also her sense of writing. So again, from Lorde, and again, you can see that so in a way represented in the narrative of Red Dust Road. This is Lorde saying, as women, we have been taught either to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion, rather than as forces for change. Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is learning to stand alone. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strength. So that's from one of her speeches in Sister Outsider in 1979. So again, she uses the concept of marginalization and being marginalized and being made a foreigner and othered as a source of strength. And again, this is a red thread that goes through Jackie Kay's work and through this memoir, where she constantly sees these elements of foreignness, of not being assimilated as something, as a sign of strength, and uses them as a sign of strength from a narrative point of view, as well as from the point of view of ideas of subjectivity and a sense of self. So these are two from Red Dust Road. So again, where I want to show you how much she constantly goes back to this idea of stories and how important stories are. She says, I wonder if my mum gave us these stories because she thought they compensated for being given up for adoption. There were the stories of my original parents having no choice. I will always be thankful to my mum for stopping me from seeing myself as somebody who was rejected. Instead, I saw myself as somebody who has been chosen. It was a heartbreaking story, and it was mine, the story of me. My brother's story of adoption and mine were the first big real stories I heard, and we both found both stories fascinating. So you can see how that links back to Audre Lorde, again, where this adoption becomes for her a story of strength, a story that gives her a sense of belonging, rather than being outcast by the birth mother. Also really interesting, in the book itself, in Red Dust Road, she only she talks of her adoptive parents as mum and dad, and then addresses her biological parents as Jonathan and Elizabeth. So again, another quote: "You cannot find yourself in two strangers who happen to share your genes. You are made already. You are made up from a mixture of myth and genes." So again, this link to Audre Lorde here. "You're part fable, part porridge. Finding a strange, nervous Mormon mother and finding a crazed, ranting, born-again father does not explain me. At least I hope not." So again, when she actually encounters her parents, she sees two people who she never imagined would be her parents. So her encounter with the father, who she meets in Nigeria, he is a born-again Christian, and he is absolutely shocked by her being a lesbian, and actually tries to do a kind of exorcism, and so that she becomes kind of normal, or is rescued from the devil, as he calls it, and he kind of dances around her for hours in order with a kind of ritual, and he calls her my sin. So he says she represents sin, and actually says doesn't want her to meet her half brothers and sisters, because for her this is all she is shame. So that for her is obviously a really hard encounter, and her mother, her biological mother, is again a very kind of she has cancer and she has Alzheimer, and she is someone who's very embittered by life, and again has real issues also to welcome her birth daughter. So, but she tells these stories without bitterness in a way. It's when you read it in the book, you come across it as she narrates them with wonderment, with a kind of detached. I don't know what's the right word is, but she's just very surprised about it, and she sees actually the narrative quality of it, and this is the story. This is for her. She represents it. These are stories. These are the other stories with interlink with the ones in my life. So there is a sense of detachment, and there is also a sense of what I would call wonderment. So in terms of that, when we read Red Dust Road, it also questions, it also kind of gives us an idea of how to read the memoir. What is a memoir? And so Patrick Madden talks about this in the new memoir, where he says, probably the most salient feature of new memoir, and that the new memoir, and that which sets it off from straight traditional popular memoir, is its tendency to subvert itself, to suggest ways of reading that call into question its own validity, or at the very least, the validity commonly afforded the written accounts people have long been offering as representative and recreative of their lives. So, and I think that is very much part of Red Dust Road. It says this is a memoir, but as you can see, a memoir is full of stories. So that needs us to rethink the idea of what a memoir is. So she says, for example, once you make a story up, it is hard not to believe yourself. We all do that. We never know where the truth ends and the story starts. So this kind of very complex relationship between truth and story is something that comes up again and again in her book. And again, she says, this is from a review in The Guardian, we all cherish our stories. They are in the family photo albums, the well-worn anecdotes, the genealogy records over which millions pore. Jackie Kay wanted to know her story, but it had been hidden. This is actually an image in Manchester at home, which is a cultural centre in Manchester. There was a theatre production of the adoption of Red Dust Road, and which was really interesting, and again showed the different. And it was mainly done via storytelling. So that was, I thought, a very sensitive adaptation of the book. So to go back to Paul Ricoeur, who talks about this ideas of destabilizing narrative identity, he says, narrative identity is not a stable and seamless identity, just as it is possible to compose several plots on the subject of the same incidents, which thus should not really be called the same events. So it is always possible to weave different, even opposed plots about our lives. In this regard, we might say that the historical component of a narrative about oneself draws this narrative towards the side of a chronicle submitted to the same documentary verifications as any other historical narration, while the fictional component draws it towards those imaginative variations that destabilize narrative identity. In this sense, narrative identity continues to make and unmake itself. So I think it's interesting how he makes this point of the tension itself in the memoir, where there's always the kind of what we might call historical fact on the one side and the other on the other imagination, and how they contribute to each other, comment on each other, but also contradict each other. But that movement itself then becomes a kind of quality of the memoir itself. Another element which is so important in the Red Dust Road is the sense of place. So there are various, and I think this is why it's called the idea of calling it Red Dust Road, because it is a road, it is traveling, it is a journey. So there's Abuja, Christchurch, Glasgow, Manchester, Milton Keynes, where her birth mother lives, Mull, where the family had, where she has childhood holidays, Nairn, Lagos, Akpor. So there are all these different places, and all these different places create this map, which also maps on her own sense of self. So identity and its relation to a sense of place is always pointed out. There are notions of home, family, and belonging that are also directly related to the concept of journeying, of being on a journey, a life journey. So she talks about this when she goes to her ancestral village. She says, at least I'd get a sense of the place I come from. The land might welcome me, and I might feel some connection with the place. And this is after the encounter with her birth father, who very much does not welcome her. And then she says, in my parents' house, which is her adoptive parents, back from Nigeria, I feel flooded with love for them. It is like the light across the land, the moonlight on the night fields. So this is then also the place of home. This is the place of home for her. Both in a way give her, she's at home in both places, but differently. So that also gives this idea that there is no such one place, as home, but home is something that can be different places at different times. So another sense which is really important and which she comments on all the time is the idea of memory. And it's the idea of memory in constructing identity. And that's particularly important because her birth mother has Alzheimer's and is losing her memories and her sense of self. And she kind of writes quite movingly about that. There's also a chapter where she goes back about holidays they had in Mull. So there's this wonderful picture. This is her father with the two children in where they had their Scottish holidays. She then sits, she says, we sit around the table and play the holidays back, and everyone remembers slightly different things. And this is a chapter where they look at photographs. So in the book itself does not, apart from the cover, does not include photographs, but there's you can find this online. There's a wonderful talk she gives, and where she shows some photographs, and where she also goes about her life story, and where she uses these photographs as a kind of jumping off point for reminiscing and kind of memories of her childhood. So the book itself is divided into kind of also makes a difference, makes a point that there is no just one person speaking here. So there's a different font. So not all chapters are written in the same font. It's not written from a chronologically, so from childhood to adult. It doesn't have this kind of ontological sense to it. And the different font, they also offer different perspectives. So there are ones which are more reflective and more essayistic, where the other ones are more based on storytelling. So there's an episodic structure which kind of also decenters the reader, because we always need to kind of think as readers, who is talking here, and how is that persona addressing us. So her identity comes into being as this sense of negotiation about these different styles. Again, this is Patrick Madden saying the author's relationship to the text, often actively playing with readers' expectations and subverting their trust by calling into question the veracity of events or recollections. So this is kind of in general where Patrick Madden talks about the new memoirs. So and how this genre kind of comments on the history and genealogy of the genre. So, but this idea of a kind of assemblage and the idea of disjointedness is not just about Kay doesn't make it just about herself, but she links it also very closely to the idea of British identity and Scottish identity. So Rieuwerts again talks about this, and he says, the notion of narrative identity can be applied to a community as well as to an individual. We can speak to the self-constancy of a community just as we spoke of it as applied to an individual subject. Individual and community are constituted in their identity by taking up narratives that become for them their actual history. And because place is so important in this memoir, and the particular places are kind of Scotland and Africa. So these are really the two places that are directly intertwined with this story of herself. This is also a story about these places and how these places need to kind of come into being via storytelling. And again, Rieuwerts, the story of a life comes to be constituted through a series of reifications applied to previous narratives, just as the history of a people proceeds from the series of corrections that new historians bring to their predecessors' descriptions and explanations. So again, the making up of places, the making up of nations. And for her, this is also very much Scottishness, because one of the first things she experiences when she comes to England is that people actually say, we can't understand you, and because of her Scottish accent. So she's kind of othered also as a Scottish person. And that experience is also very important. And obviously, this is something which has been written about, and Benedict Anderson is probably the most prominent one about this, where he talks about the idea of the definition of a nation, where he says, I propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear them. Yet in their minds of each lies the image of their communion. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity, genuineness, by the style in which they are imagined. So this style of imagination, that is something that in a way haunts Jackie Kay's memoir. It's very clear that her sense of belonging, her sense of Scottishness, her sense of a Black person is a kind of imagined identity, but that doesn't mean it's not true, but it kind of constantly kind of comments on these different ways of imagination. And obviously we are now living in a world where this idea of the definition of a nation has become yet again so important in many stories. So kind of how we tell these stories has become even more important again. So again, this is Benedict Anderson, where he says the fellow members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members. Sorry, I've just said, actually, that's a competition, a repetition of what I just said. But I kind of thought this really interesting, the idea of the style of the telling and the style and the idea of how the narratives are connected to each other. So it should be another quote here, but, you know, unfortunately, you know, I've got the wrong one here. But I think you get my drift here, this idea of the nation as imagination. And it really is like a red thread through her book, and it kind of comments on Scottishness. For her Scottishness is as much something she reflects on as being Black, as being adopted, as being a woman, as being a lesbian. So she connects all these different stories together. And again, in her collection of poetry, In My Country, which is from Other Lovers, the collection, this is a quote: "Walking by the waters down where an honest river shakes hands with the sea, a woman passed round me in a slow, watchful circle, as I were a superstition, or the words drags of her imagination. So when she finally spoke, her words spliced into bars of an old wheel, a segment of air. Where do you come from? Here, I said, here, these parts." So again, this is a kind of wonderful comment on this constant force of asking about origins, about wanting to root ourselves in kind of in origins, in this kind of origin stories, you know, that and that is national stories as well as ideas of sexual identity. And I think when we read the newspapers at the moment, we know that these kind of competing stories of who we are, this is where the so-called culture wars are very much fought, but it is also very much political wars that are going on about these ideas of identity. So for her, there is this idea that nationality actually is something, it is kind of, it's like a knitting project. Yeah, we knit ourselves, and Scottishness is this one part of the knitting that is there, but it is also qualified by other patterns that are created by it. So when in Redhurst Road, there's a lovely story when she visits Aberdeen to contribute to a school project titled Threats in the Tartan. And she says she appreciates the all-inclusiveness of it. And then the teacher says, it's time that Scotland embraced being a multicultural society. It's time we changed the image of ourselves. So for Kay, as well as for this teacher, national identity is no longer a given, but it becomes a project. It becomes a project in which we are all involved. And I think Retta Strode is a kind of a part of that project and contributes to it. And this idea of multiculturalism obviously also should include questions of sexual identity. And there's a fantastic publication which is called Gendering the Nation, which was edited by Christopher White, which comments on multiculturalism on kind of Scottish and queer. So when this was published in 1995, it caused quite a stir. White insisted in his introduction that to be gay and to be Scottish, it would seem, are still mutually exclusive conditions. And the book is dedicated to Alistair Cameron, who also appears in Red Dust Road and is one of Kay's closest friends and who tragically died from HIV-related causes in 1994. So for her, Scottishness should also be inclusive of queerness, of queer identities, and it should be, and it should, in a way, there should be a dialogue between Scottish identity and queer identity. Unfortunately, we have just seen that these this discussion has turned into something quite well, quite a headline creating at the moment with the Supreme Court and with the idea of which obviously came from a group of Scottish women about transgender identity. So it just shows how these ideas are still really difficult and really complex. And I think it shows also how Red Dust Road, which constantly refers to these ideas of how these different elements should in a way work together like a jigsaw that is constantly reorganized, creates not only just a memoir of a person and personal identity, but also of national identity and sexual identity. So, and this obviously, her queerness is a real issue when she has this encounter with her birth father. Jonathan, who is her birth father, she says, I realize with a fresh horror that Jonathan is seeing me as the sin, me as impure, me as the bastard, illegitimate. I am sitting here, evidence of his sinful past, but I am the sinner, the life embodiment of his sin. So this is again in the production. It was really, they recreated or interpreted it in such a fantastic way, you know, where this where she is kind of static and the father is dancing about her because he wants to kind of exercise this demon of lesbianism. So you are evidence of my past. Once I used, this is the father, once I used to go clubbing and such and drink wine and meet women, and now I'm a preacher. You are my before. This is my after. You are my sin. Now I lead this life. And so he is very much kind of concerned that and sees her actually as contagious and doesn't want to want her to see her half brothers and sisters. He says, why should you agree to keep yourself a secret? It's wrong. And this is kind of Jackie Kay talking to herself and says, well, I am not a secret, you know, that is, you know, your secret, but it is wrong for me to see myself with your eyes. So what we have here is really this idea, the discovery and this embrace of a hybrid identity. So she kind of talks about it, how she kind of sees this whole project of the memoir. She says, part of me came from Africa, part of me was foreign to myself, strange to myself, since I had never been to the dark continent and could only really have it burning away hot and dusty in my mind. It is not so much that being black in a white country makes you a stranger to yourself. It is not the foreigner without, it is the foreigner within. Every time somebody in your own country asks you where you are from, every time you indignantly replied, I'm from here, you are subconsciously caught up in asking that question again and again yourself, particularly when you are a child. So I'm kind of used the second, kind of wanted to kind of use that second half of that quote, which I used before, because I think it's really interesting how that idea of that question, where do you come from originally, you know, how that can be a devastating question. And she says further on, I felt strong that I'd arrived at a place where I could properly acknowledge my African heritage and be proud. The problem was I went too far the other way and didn't dwell on even like being Scottish until I met the African-American poet Audre Lorde in 1984, who told me that I could be proudly African and Scottish, and that I should embrace both. One need not exclude the other, she said in her decisive drawl. Oh, that was startling advice to receive at the age of 23, and I took it. It was a relief. I didn't need to choose. So again, this idea that the idea of identity is a question of choice, and her not choosing and kind of having this reassurance by someone like Audre Lorde, who shares certain aspects of Kay's life, is something that always goes through the book, that relief of not having to choose, of being Scottish and black and queer and lesbian. So this idea of coming home is not a coming home to an end place, but it's the road. So she says, we turn into a road that takes my breath away. The whole time I've been in Nigeria, I've never come across a red dust road exactly like the one in my imagination until I come to my own home village, take my shoes off so the red earth can touch my bare soles. It is as if my footprints were already on the road before I even got there. I walk into them, my waiting footsteps. There's a feeling of liberation and exhilaration that at last, at last, I'm here. It feels a million miles away from Glasgow, from my lovely Fintry Hills, but surprisingly, it also feels like home. The road welcomes me. It is benevolent, warm, friendly, accepting, and for now it feels enough. The red of it, the vivid green against it, the long and winding red dust road. Thank you very much.